Iran is seeing its largest protests in several years, driven by a collapsing currency, high inflation, and deepening public anger, now met with arrests and a tightening security response. The head of the Iranian judiciary says there will be no more leniency for, quote, rioters after more than a week of demonstrations. Iranian President Massoud Pezeshkian signaled willingness to engage with the protesters last week, but since then, the demonstrations have spread. Activists say at least 20 people have been killed and hundreds detained so far. As pressure grows, Tehran is also pushing back against what it calls foreign interference, accusing Western and Israeli leaders of inflaming unrest inside the country.
Actions or statements raised by figures such as the Prime Minister of the Zionist regime or some radical American officials regarding Iran's internal affairs amounts, under international norms, to nothing more than incitement to violence, incitement to terrorism, and incitement to killing.
Well, the statement by the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman came after Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that his country was with the protesters. And U.S. President Donald Trump has this warning for Iran's leadership.
We're watching it very closely. If they start killing people like they have in the past, I think they're going to get hit very hard by the United States.
All right, let's keep the conversation going now. I'm joined by Holly Dagres. She's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute with a focus on Iran. Holly, it's good to have you with us. You know, we just heard the U.S. president there saying that Iran will be hit very hard if protesters are killed. Does that kind of rhetoric, does it raise the cost of repression for the regime, or does it help Tehran to basically tell people in Iran, see, we've been saying it all along, this unrest is driven by foreign powers?
Well, it's a complicated thing to unpack. This is the first time we've actually seen a U.S. president directly make comments like that. In 2009, the Barack Obama administration decided they weren't going to make any comments about the post-election protests at the time, and protesters in the streets famously chanted, "Obama, you're with us or you're with them," referring to the clerical establishment. Right now, we're about a little over a week into the protests. As of yesterday, we've had at least 19 deaths and at least 933 arrested. This is a regime that has a history of cracking down on protesters brutally, such as during the 2022 Women Life Freedom Uprising, in which the United Nations fact-finding mission had found that crimes against humanity were committed against the people at the time. So when you're hearing these comments,
If I could, let me just interrupt you there and ask you, do you think if we could ask the protesters now in Iran, would they say, yes, Donald Trump is on our side?
To an extent, yes, but the question is, will he really act on those words? We've also seen him say things and not do them, and we've had U.S. presidents like also Barack Obama talk about a red line with Syria and then not act on it. So it's a really mixed bag with whether the president will be actually doing something about with what he's been talking about with this rhetoric for the past few days.
You know, after last year's short Iran-Israel conflict and U.S. strikes, is international pressure, is it now genuinely dangerous for the regime, or do you think it's somewhat of a useful political shield for them?
Well, I think that after the events in Venezuela, the clerical establishment is not resting well because we've just seen not just the comments by President Trump that you noted earlier, but we've seen the events in Venezuela. And then at the end of December, we saw a meeting between President Donald Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, where Trump said he would back Israeli strikes on Iran's ballistic missiles program, which means that there could be a possibility of a second war, which many analysts and ordinary Iranians even think would be eventually happening at some point in some time this year. So I think that looking at those dynamics at play, it's not a very good time to be the Islamic Republic, and there are real concerns about the stability of the regime within the clerical establishment.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Venezuela. You know, they just experienced a dramatic event in the last 72 hours involving U.S. force. We saw the president of Venezuela taken by U.S. forces. He's now in New York. He's facing charges, criminal charges there. What message do Iranian protesters, what message do they take from basically watching Venezuela unfold before their very eyes?
Well, I think what's noteworthy about Maduro being taken, it's just him. It's just him as the leader of a country that's been removed, one that was no longer recognized by its people, or else overall the regime has not changed or collapsed since the events over the weekend. And I think that's noteworthy. It doesn't necessarily mean that things are going to change on the ground. What concerns me is that you had a Maria Machado, who is a transitional leader, and that Trump has actually dismissed her and said that she is not respected in the country. And we've seen that the vice president of Venezuela take the helm. And so it seems to me that so far this has just been a very symbolic gesture, a very big, important one, albeit, but it's one that hasn't really toppled the regime in Venezuela just yet. And so I think it's one of those things we'll have to wait and see. But in the context of Iran, Iran and Venezuela are very different countries, though they are allies and oil rich and heavily sanctioned. But looking at them, I mean, it's hard not to look at the events in Venezuela and think that the Trump administration might have its eyes on Iran in some shape or form next.
Well, you know, the president of the U.S. and Marco Rubio, his Secretary of State, they've made it clear that their first priority is the United States. Second priority is the Western Hemisphere. That's what they're focused on right now. That, if you're, taking that to the next step, that would leave the Iranians kind of out in the cold. How concerned are you that if the U.S. does follow this, as they're calling it, the updated Monroe Doctrine, for example, of hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, what does that mean then for the future of Iran if people are hoping for U.S. support?
Well, I've always believed that change must come from the people, not from the outside via bombs. But, the events of the region since October 7th, the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the maiming of Hezbollah and Hamas in Lebanon and Gaza, it suggests to me that the United States doesn't necessarily have to have its hand directly in the events of the region. It's something that Israel's been taking the lead on. And given that they've been pushing for a second round of war, their secondary and tertiary goals, at least it appeared in the first war, was destabilization of the regime. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if another war was to start, that Israel would go for the head of the snake, that it would try to take out the clerical leadership, like the supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. But we're operating in a world now where the world, it's full of surprises, and we have to be open to that. Because even as somebody here in Washington, I can give policy recommendations, but this is an administration that seems to have their own ideas on how they would like the things to move forward, and it seems in very unconventional ways than we're used to in previous administrations.
But Holly, in terms of a future, strike by Israel against Iran, do you see events in Venezuela and the rhetoric that is coming from the White House? Does that tell you that Washington is going to give Israel a long leash here, a free rein to do what it thinks that it has to do about Iran?
I'm not entirely sure what that leash would look like, but I think it's clear that the president has endorsed a secondary strike on Iran from his December meeting with the Israeli prime minister. But given the events of these protests over the past week, that leash could be longer, as you've noted. But it's really hard to say where things can go from here, except that the way that the direction of the events in Iran is suggesting that the country's doomed for another conflict because of the inflexibility of the supreme leader and his inability to actually either step down or actually try to make big changes that would be positive. But I think that it's too late. Reform has been dead for years, and it's not just me saying that, but activists like Iran-based Nobel laureate Narges Mohammadi.
Before we run out of time, let me ask you just about the nature of these protests in Iran. The protests, they appear to be fueled by economic freefall. We're talking about currency collapse, inflation, daily life becoming basically unlivable, or things not being affordable anymore. what's the most important thing that our viewers should understand about why this wave is happening and why it's happening now?
As you know, this was a trigger, the economy, but the core issues is that there's systemic mismanagement, corruption, and repression. And this is exactly the sentiment that was felt during the 2022 Woman Life Freedom Uprising. But if you pay attention to the chants in 2022 and now, they are anti-regime in nature. The people are very openly and clearly saying they do not want an Islamic republic. And there have been calls from activists on the ground for a transition, for a constitutional assembly, and a referendum. So this is what people inside the country want. They want change. They do not want this regime. And reform has been dead for a long time.
Holly Dagres, Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute. Holly, we appreciate your time and your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.